Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and a very warm welcome to UNIDIR's Cyber Stability Conference of 2023. And on behalf of UNIDIR, we're truly delighted that you're able to join us either in person here in New York or online for what is the 10th edition of UNIDIR's flagship event. This year, the Cyber Stability Conference focuses on the very first source of international law that states ever agreed on being applicable in cyberspace, the Charter of the United Nations. As participants to this conference will be very keenly aware, worldwide malicious cyber operations are increasingly pervasive. They undermine international peace and security, and they hamper prosperity and development. Malicious cyber activities are undertaken for financial and political gains, to manipulate public opinion, or to prepare or support battlefield operations. Very often they blur the lines between war and peace, and above all, they pose severe risks to societies, especially to critical infrastructures and services. It is against this backdrop that the UN Secretary General, in his recent briefing to the General Assembly on 2023 priorities, not only recognized the need to address these urgent threats to international peace and security, but also acknowledged the unacceptable nature of cyber operations against critical infrastructure. Today, it has been almost 25 years since the first resolution on information and communication technology security was adopted, and since then, significant progress has been achieved through various iterations of the group of governmental experts first, and then the two open-ended working groups that followed. States have, of course, long agreed that international law applies to cyberspace, but to date, little progress has been made in deepening common understandings of how international law applies in this domain. Some states, as documented also on UNIDIR's cyber policy portal, have publicly released their national interpretations, but overall, this remains an underexplored area. Now, recent events over the past 3 years alone, with a global pandemic that accelerated digital transformation, that opened new attack surfaces and attack vectors, and of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine, all of this has shown that progress in actions is more than in theory urgently needed. Norms need to be implemented, and international law must be upheld, and in order to do this, we must know what the law requires. Agreeing that international law is applicable to the digital domain can only ever be a first step, and it is crucial that more specific discussions are held to elaborate on how it applies. This is a logical and indeed fundamental step in mitigating the cyber and digital threats to international peace and security, reducing the risk of unintended escalation and protecting civilians from harm. UNIDIR's institutional vision points towards a more stable and secure world, and in the 21st century, this cannot be achieved without considering the security and stability of the digital domain. Since its inaugural edition in 2012, UNIDIR's Cyber Stability Conference has aimed to promote a more stable and predictable digital environment by providing a platform for states and other stakeholders to engage in substantive exchanges without the formalities of official processes, and advancing over the years shared understandings on a variety of issues, including those more challenging to unpack, like international law. Now, against this backdrop, the 23 Cyber Stability Conference focuses on the content of core legal principles and thresholds in cyberspace through the prism of the UN Charter, and it considers 4 key thematic areas selected among those more prominently referenced in past discussions. So today we will focus first on the prohibition on the use of force. We will then turn to the notion of armed attack and self-defense. We will consider the role and powers of the UN Security Council, and last but most certainly not least, the peaceful settlement of disputes. The purpose of the Cyber Stability Conference 2023 is twofold: to increase transparency and to deepen our understanding of how international law at the intersection of technology and law applies in cyberspace. As such, CS23 will provide a platform for sharing national interpretations and perspectives on international law, and to build knowledge to hopefully support progress on this important topic in the upcoming open-ended working group deliberations. The timing and the location of this year's Cyber Stability Conference is, of course, not a coincidence. We decided to hold CS23 here in New York just before the fourth formal session of the open-ended working group next week to facilitate the participation and engagement of as many national cyber experts as possible. We certainly hope that all stakeholders joining us here today will take advantage of this opportunity, and we invite you all to actively participate in the discussions. Now, UNIDIR is undertaking a range of activities in the domain of cybersecurity, and as many of you will know, we're a voluntary funded organization, and so UNIDIR's 23 Cyber Stability Conference would not be possible without the generous support of our donors, to whom we're most grateful. The conference, organized by UNIDIR's Security and Technology Program, is generously supported by contributions from the Czech Republic, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and Microsoft. And with this, it's my great pleasure to welcome Izumi Nakamitzu, the UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, and Ambassador Burhan Gafoor, Permanent Representative of Singapore and Chair of the Open-Ended Working Group 21 to 25, who will both deliver now their opening remarks. We're immensely grateful for both of your support to this conference and to UNIDIR more generally, and with this, I hand the floor over to you, Izumi.
Thank you very much, Robin, Your Excellency Ambassador Gafoor, Burhan, dear Robin, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. I am so happy to be able to address this 2023 UNIDIR Cyber Stability Conference, and congratulations on the 10th anniversary of this flagship conference series. Now, this event is convened at a very timely and, I would say, critical moment. We are on the eve of the fourth substantive session of the Open-Ended Working Group on security of and in the use of information and communications technologies, as you pointed out. Next week, this Open-Ended Working Group embarks on its third year of substantive work under the very strong leadership of Ambassador Gafoor. The group meets in the wake of consensus adoption of a first annual progress report in July, and also highly constructive, I would say, informal intersessional meetings that took place in December last year. So I have high hopes for progress by this body, OEWG, but that has not been anything but assured. In the face of unprecedented challenges as a consequence of the war in Ukraine, including those of direct relevance to the peace and security of cyberspace, the working group has been able to find some areas of convergence and identify topics for further discussion. Through its first annual progress report, states reaffirmed the agreements reached in the previous open-ended working group and groups of governmental experts, thus further solidifying commitment to the normative framework for responsible state behavior in the use of information and communications technologies. Underpinning this normative framework is states' universal affirmation of the applicability of international law to state use of ICTs. In this regard, I applaud UNIDIR's selection of the theme for the Cyber Stability Conference this year, use of ICTs by states, rights and responsibilities under the UN Charter. Gaining greater clarity on how international law, including the Charter of the United Nations, applies to the use of ICTs by states remains a critically important objective. A steady stream of malicious cyber activity taking place in connection with the war in Ukraine injects a heightened sense of urgency to the task to unpack the responsibilities of states under the Charter in relation to cyberspace. Alarm bells have been rung over cyber incidents that could cause physical harm, analogous to attacks undertaken with conventional weapons. And we hear concerns about malicious ICT activity that might result in the incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, or damage to civilian objects. Fortunately, states' discussion on how international law applies to the use of ICTs is yielding some progress. There is no longer any doubt that international law, in particular the Charter of the United Nations, is applicable and indeed essential to maintaining peace and stability for promoting an open, secure, stable, accessible, and peaceful ICT environment. Building on this most fundamental common understanding, the intergovernmental processes on ICT security, the first and subsequent open-ended working group, and the 6 groups of governmental experts have vigorously explored questions of applicability. The report of the 6th and the most recent group of governmental experts in particular added important layers of understanding to how international law applies, including in relation to various provisions of the Charter, such as the peaceful resolution of disputes, non-interference in the internal affairs of states, and the non-use of force in international affairs. This expert group also importantly recognized the need for further study on how and when principles of international humanitarian law apply to the use of ICTs by states, and underscored that recalling these principles by no means legitimizes or encourages conflict. This language was recalled in the first annual progress report of the current working group. To facilitate discussions on applicability of law, states have been encouraged to share and make public their national views. The views of 20 states are currently published on the Open-Ended Working Group webpage, including those states that submitted views as part of the official compendium of voluntary national contributions, published in the framework of the 2019 and 2021 group of governmental experts, and that is A/76/136. I would strongly encourage all states to consider making available their national views. Views on the applicability of the UN Charter, international humanitarian and international human rights law, and other general principles of international law, including state sovereignty, to cyberspace would go a long way in supporting deepened common understandings. Discussions today in this conference would touch upon critical aspects that merit concerted attention, including questions related to the use of force, the right of self-defense, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. As states continue to tackle these vital but also very complex concepts, inputs from a variety of experts, from legal experts to academics to representatives of the private sector, will only become more valuable. In this way, I welcome the introductory, introductory briefings to be provided by experts to this conference today. Ladies and gentlemen, cyberspace is not a lawless space. The Charter of the United Nations and other international law are basis for states' shared commitment to preventing conflict and maintaining international peace and security. Cyberspace is no exception. The Charter and the obligations therein must unequivocally guide state action in this domain. I thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you all a successful conference.
Thank you very much, Undersecretary General Nakamitzu. And without further ado, I'll pass the floor to His Excellency Ambassador Burhan Gafoor.
Thank you very much, Robin. I'm very delighted to join UNIDIR's Cyber Stability Conference. This is the first time that I am participating in this conference, and I'm delighted to hear that it's the 10th anniversary of the conference. I also would like to acknowledge the presence of Undersecretary General and High Representative for Disarmament Affairs, Izumi Nakamitzu. My good friend, thank you very much for your leadership and all that you do on the disarmament front at a very critical moment in international relations. And my thanks also to Robin and his team at UNIDIR for all the work that they do in encouraging and supporting interstate discussions on various issues, including on the question of cyber security. I'd like to offer some reflections today in my capacity as chair of the Open-Ended Working Group on ICT security or cyber security. The theme for today's discussion, which is use of ICTs by states, rights and responsibilities under the Charter, fits very nicely into the work of the Open-Ended Working Group. The mandate of the Open-Ended Working Group is, of course, much larger than today's topic. The mandate of the working group covers a range of issues, existing and potential threats, rules and norms for responsible state behavior, international law, confidence building measures, capacity building, and regular institutional dialogue. So within the Open-Ended Working Group, as chair of the process, I have always advocated the need to take a balanced view of all the issues under the mandate of the working group. Now, in that context, a discussion on international law is very timely, and I think it can help to contribute to the discussions in the Open-Ended Working Group. The first point that I want to make is that the work of the Open-Ended Working Group in itself is a reflection of the commitment of member states to creating stability in cyberspace. This should be acknowledged and recognized. The fact that we have an open-ended working group, which is universal in nature and transparent in the way it works and inclusive in the way it takes decision, itself creates a level of trust and confidence among member states, which in turn contributes to cyber stability. I've often said within the working group that the working group or the OEWG is in itself a confidence building measure. And it is therefore important to recognize the inherent value of having an inclusive and democratic process based at the United Nations to allow for conversations on very challenging issues, of which international law is a very important part. Now, the fact that members have all agreed that international law applies in cyberspace is a very strong foundation, and it's a good starting point. But under that rubric, there are a range of issues that we need to discuss, and that indeed is what we are trying to do in the Open-Ended Working Group. But the work of the Open-Ended Working Group will be complemented by conversations like this, because these kind of fora will allow for a freer discussion, deeper exchange of views between policymakers, practitioners, academics, and other stakeholders. So I'm really hoping that this discussion today, through the various panel discussions, will feed into the discussions that we will have in the formal meeting that begins next week. Now, the second point that I want to make is that when we talk about international law, the role of the UN Charter is extremely important because the Charter is the foundation of the work that we do here at the United Nations. The multilateral system is founded on international law and the UN Charter, and this provides the framework for state behavior and state responsibilities, and state rights on a range of issues, including in the domain of cyberspace. In that sense, the various discussions today, I hope, will allow us to get deeper into some of the specific topics that comes under international law. Now, as part of the mandate of the working group, within the rubric of international law, there are a range of issues: peaceful settlement of disputes, how the UN Charter applies, the principles of sovereignty, sovereign equality, and non-interference, and also issues which are more challenging, such as how international humanitarian law applies. And the discussion relating also to the need for a legally binding agreement is a discussion that is important within the mandate of the open-ended working group. I have taken the approach within the open-ended working group that given the range of views and differences among member states, it is important to take an incremental approach, a step-by-step approach, and a focused approach. Last July, we adopted an annual progress report, and in that progress report, we agreed that the open-ended working group will have focused discussions on specific topics, including in the area of international law. So it is my hope that at the next formal session, the fourth substantive session, which begins next week, we will be able to begin focused discussions on some of the difficult issues under the rubric of international law. Peaceful settlement of disputes is an issue that I think we all need to address because it has relevance not only for cyberspace, but for international peace and security at large. The principle of sovereignty, sovereign equality, and non-interference in member states is another important issue, as I said. And the role of international humanitarian law and the need for a legally binding agreement are also issues that I hope that we will be able to get into at some point in the work of the working group. The final point I want to make for today's remarks is that the question of international law also is in some ways related to capacity building. It is also related in some ways to confidence building measures. Because talking about the importance of international law is in itself an affirmation that states are committed to international law. And that, in turn, I hope, will create a level of confidence among member states and, more importantly, enhance levels of trust. Equally important is the question of capacity building. Over the last 2 decades, as Under-Secretary General Nakamitzu mentioned, there has been 6 GGEs, and we are now into the second iteration of the open-ended working group process. So there is a corpus of convergence that is already there. There is a strong framework of rules, norms, and principles of responsible state behavior. And we also have agreed in the open-ended working group last July that this is a cumulative and evolving framework, which means that this is a framework that we can build upon and must build upon. And in that context, I think it is important to enhance levels of knowledge, levels of awareness, and levels of capacity in all countries, especially many developing countries, small countries, for whom the whole question of cyber security and ICT security is a relatively new domain. So we should not underestimate the importance of engaging and expanding the circle of discussion on these issues in order to bring in countries who may not have been involved in this process over the last 25 years, and hence the need for engagement, awareness, as well as capacity building. Let me conclude by saying that as the open-ended working group begins the second cycle of its work this year, we are committed to continuing the positive trajectory of delivering outcomes. It is my hope as chair that in July, we will be in a position to adopt a second annual progress report that I hope will be able to capture additional details on a range of issues under the mandate of the open-ended working group, including, hopefully, some convergence on additional elements relating to international law. I think it is important for the working group to deliver a substantive annual progress report in July this year. But in order to get there, it is important that all member states remain very much committed, and I have been very encouraged by the very constructive tone that I've seen so far in the process, the very positive engagement, and I dare say increasing levels of comfort and confidence, and maybe even increasing levels of trust within the open-ended working group. Now, the road ahead is long, and it's going to be winding, but that, my dear friends, is what we do at the United Nations. We keep trying, we do not give up, we continue to engage in a multilateral process, because no matter how different our views may be, this is where we must sit down, talk to each other, have a dialogue, build convergence, find results, and take another step forward, which is what I hope to do in the OEWG process. And I want to thank all the participants in this call and conference for your presence today, either in person or in virtual screens. Thank you very much for your work and continued participation. And a final shout out to all the stakeholders. We remain committed to engaging with you in the open-ended working group process. And as chair of the process, I've taken the approach that I will engage with stakeholders in a systematic, sustained, and substantive manner, because I value your inputs, and my sense is that members also value your inputs. The final shout out is to underline the importance of the gender dimension. Next week, the United Nations begins the Commission on Status of Women, the 67th session on the Commission on the Status of Women. And the theme for the session is digital technologies in general. And so the work of the open-ended working group is very relevant, and it is important that we allow and empower and enhance the participation of women in our process, because in each of our societies, it is important also to enhance, empower, and enlarge the participation of women in the tech sector, including in the cyber security sector, which should not be a domain for the men alone, but we should have balanced gender representation. That is also an important issue for many countries. So friends, I can go on, but I know that I've taken more time than I should have, and I wanted to once again thank Robin for giving me the opportunity, and Izumi, thank you for your presence today.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Gafoor, and thank you very much, Undersecretary General Nakamitzu. Thank you both for your inspiring remarks and for setting the scene for the rest of the day so very, very nicely. I'm now happy to introduce Dr. Giacomo Persi-Paoli, who's the head of UNIDIR's Security and Technology Program, and he will be moderating your first panel. Thank you all very much for joining us. I wish you an engaging discussion throughout the day and a productive and hopefully great conference. Thank you all.